Her shy employee left a note by mistake. Then the millionaire called an emergency meeting. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. She never imagined that a simple mistake could change everything, but sometimes destiny writes itself in the most unexpected ways. The elevator doors slid shut with the familiar hum that had become the soundtrack to Naomi Ellis's mornings for the past 3 years. 27 floors up to the gleaming headquarters of Radcliffe Industries, where she had perfected the art of being invisible. Naomi adjusted the strap of her worn leather bag, checking her reflection in the polished steel doors. Her dark curls were pulled back in a neat bun, her navy blazer pressed and conservative. She had learned early that blending in was safer than standing out, especially in a world of glass offices and silent judgment. The 43rd floor buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Phones rang in measured intervals, keyboards clicked like distant rain, and conversations happened in hushed tones that never quite reached her corner desk. As a sectoral assistant, Naomi lived in the spaces between, organizing files that others would present, scheduling meetings she wouldn't attend, ensuring the machinery ran smoothly while remaining unseen. She settled into her chair, pulling out her daily planner. Each task was written in her careful handwriting, color-coded by priority, but tucked between the pages was something else, a small ritual she'd maintained since college, a handwritten note meant for herself, a quiet reminder to find meaning in the mundane. Kindness doesn't need an audience. Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the biggest hearts. N.E. She had dozens of them, scattered throughout her apartment, pressed between books, taped to her bathroom mirror, little anchors of hope in a world that often felt indifferent. Across the floor, through walls of frosted glass, Julian Radcliffe moved through his domain with quiet authority. At 35, he commanded attention without demanding it. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his movements deliberate, his presence filling rooms even when he said nothing at all. Naomi had watched him from afar, not with the dreamy fascination of the other assistants, but with genuine curiosity. She had seen him pause outside the window during thunderstorms, his face softening as he watched the rain paint patterns on the glass. She had witnessed him quietly slip a check to Marcus from maintenance when his daughter needed surgery. These moments, when he thought no one was looking, revealed something beneath the corporate armor. "Ellis, I need these contracts delivered to Mrs. Whitmore in legal before lunch," barked Deanna Walsh, the floor supervisor, dropping a stack of documents onto Naomi's desk with unnecessary force. "And make sure they're sorted by date. Last time Henderson mixed them up, and I'm not cleaning up another mess." "Of course, Mrs. Walsh." Naomi gathered the papers carefully, checking her watch. She had 40 minutes before the lunch deadline, plenty of time if she hurried. But as she rushed toward the elevator, juggling the contracts and her bag, her daily motivation note slipped from her planner. Without thinking, she grabbed it and placed it on the nearest desk, intending to retrieve it later. The elevator arrived, and she stepped inside, her mind already moving to the next task. The contracts needed to be perfect. Mrs. Whitmore in legal was notorious for sending back anything with even the smallest error. What Naomi didn't realize was that the nearest desk belonged to the corner office on the 43rd floor, the office with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of Central Park. The office where Julian Radcliffe had just returned from a board meeting that had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about leadership. He loosened his tie, feeling the weight of another day spent discussing profit margins and market shares. The acquisition talks with the Portland Textile Company had stalled again, and 3 department heads were pushing for layoffs he wasn't ready to approve. Sometimes he wondered if his father's empire had become a beautiful cage, trapping them all in cycles of endless ambition. That's when he saw it, a small piece of paper, cream-colored and folded once, sitting on his mahogany desk like a message from another world. His assistant, Beverly, never left anything on his desk without prior arrangement. Security was too tight for random documents to appear. Julian unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the handwritten words. "Kindness doesn't need an audience. Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the biggest hearts." N.E. He read it again, and again. The handwriting was gentle, feminine, each letter formed with care. But it was the message itself that made him sit down heavily in his leather chair. When had he last performed an act of kindness without calculation? When had he last considered the hearts behind the profit statements? His finger traced the initials. N.E. Beverly knocked and entered without waiting for permission, carrying his afternoon coffee and a stack of reports. "The quarterly projections are ready for your review, Mr. Radcliffe. Also, the Seattle team called about—" "Beverly," Julian interrupted, holding up the note. "Do you know how this got here?" She adjusted her glasses, studying the paper. "I've never seen it before. Perhaps someone from cleaning—" "No." Julian stood, walking to the window. "Someone left this for me. Intentionally or not, someone wanted me to read this today." Beverly shifted uncomfortably. After 12 years as his assistant, she had learned to read his moods. This was different, contemplative, almost vulnerable. "Should I investigate, sir?" Julian turned back to his desk, carefully placing the note in his top drawer. "Not yet, but I want to know who N.E. is." 3 hours later, as Naomi gathered her things to leave for the day, panic struck her like a cold wave. The note. Her daily reminder. The one she had mindlessly dropped somewhere during her rush to legal. She searched her desk frantically, checking every drawer, every folder. Nothing. Looking for something. Deanna Walsh appeared beside her cubicle, arms crossed. Just a piece of paper I seem to have misplaced. Nothing important." Deanna's smile was sharp. "Well, whatever it was, I hope it wasn't confidential. You know how Mr. Radcliffe feels about careless employees." Naomi's heart sank. If she had somehow violated company policy, if she had left personal items where they didn't belong. As she waited for the elevator, her phone buzzed with a company-wide email. "Emergency meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m., conference room A, all sectoral staff required to attend, no exceptions. J. Radcliffe, CEO." The elevator doors opened, but Naomi couldn't move. Emergency meetings meant layoffs. They meant investigations. They meant the end of the invisible safety she had built around herself. And somewhere on the 43rd floor, Julian Radcliffe sat in his office, holding a small piece of paper that had somehow changed the trajectory of his entire day. He had no idea that the woman who wrote those words was standing frozen in an elevator, wondering if tomorrow would be her last day at Radcliffe Industries, but he was about to find out. What if a simple note you wrote to yourself completely changed the course of your life? Naomi has no idea that her words touched the heart of New York's most powerful CEO, but will she survive the emergency meeting he called? What would you do if you found out that your most intimate thoughts had fallen into the wrong hands, or were they the right hands? Sometimes the storm you're running from is actually leading you home. Naomi barely slept. She had spent the entire night replaying every interaction from the past week, searching for any mistake that could have triggered an emergency meeting. Her small studio apartment in Queens felt even smaller as she paced between her kitchenette and the single window overlooking the fire escape. At 3 a.m. she had called her sister Tessa, who lived in Philadelphia. "Maybe it's just a restructuring announcement," Tessa had said, her voice thick with sleep. "Companies do that all the time. It doesn't mean you're in trouble." But Naomi knew better. In 3 years at Radcliffe Industries, she had never seen Julian Radcliffe call an emergency meeting for an entire department. The man who spoke only when necessary, who made decisions with surgical precision, didn't waste time on company-wide announcements, unless something was seriously wrong. By 7 a.m. she was already dressed in her most professional outfit, a black blazer she had bought for her interview 3 years ago, paired with a white blouse and her grandmother's small pearl earrings. If this was going to be her last day, she would face it with dignity. The subway ride into Manhattan felt eternal. Every face around her seemed to know something she didn't. Every conversation sounded like whispered judgments. She clutched her bag tighter, the same leather purse that had carried her through college interviews, job applications, and countless days of trying to prove she belonged in spaces that felt too big for her. Radcliffe Industries loomed against the morning sky, its glass facade reflecting the bustling streets below. Naomi had always found comfort in its imposing presence, but today it felt like a fortress she might never enter again. The 43rd floor was buzzing with nervous energy. Clusters of employees gathered around coffee stations and copy machines, their voices low but urgent. Deanna Walsh stood near the reception area, clipboard in hand, checking names off a list with the efficiency of a drill sergeant. "Ellis," she called out as Naomi approached. "Conference room A. Take a seat anywhere you can find one." Conference room A was the largest meeting space on the floor, usually reserved for client presentations and board meetings. Today it was packed with every sectoral assistant, junior analyst and administrative staff member. The air felt thick with anxiety and the scent of too much coffee. Naomi found an empty chair near the back, next to Fitzgerald Chen from IT support and Carmen Rodriguez from Human Resources. Neither acknowledged her presence. Everyone was too focused on the empty podium at the front of the room. "Any idea what this is about?" whispered Fitzgerald, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by worry lines around his eyes. Carmen shook her head. "I've been with the company 8 years. Never seen anything like this." The room fell silent as Beverly, Julian's assistant, entered and began setting up a microphone. Her usual composed expression revealed nothing, but Naomi noticed her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the sound equipment. At exactly 9 a.m., the double doors opened, and Julian Radcliffe walked in. The effect was immediate. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, chairs stopped creaking, even the air conditioning seemed to quiet itself. He wore a navy suit that fit him like it had been designed specifically for this moment, and his presence filled the room in a way that made everyone sit straighter. But there was something different about him today. His usual controlled composure seemed softer somehow, more human. He stepped up to the podium, his grey eyes scanning the room slowly. When his gaze passed over Naomi, she felt her cheeks warm, but he moved on without pause. "I know you're all wondering why I called this meeting," he began, his voice carrying easily through the room without the microphone. "And I know that emergency meetings in this industry usually mean layoffs or restructuring." A collective intake of breath rippled through the audience. Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs. "That's not why you're here," Julian continued, and the relief in the room was palpable. "You're here because yesterday something reminded me of why we're really here. Not just the numbers, not just the quarterly reports, but the people who make this company more than just profit margins." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. Naomi's world tilted. Her note. Her daily reminder. The cream-colored paper she had written on during her lunch break 2 days ago, sitting in the small cafe around the corner, where she sometimes ate alone. "Yesterday, someone left this on my desk," Julian said, unfolding the paper carefully. "I don't know if it was intentional or accidental, but the message changed my entire perspective on leadership." He cleared his throat and read aloud. "Kindness doesn't need an audience. Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the biggest hearts." Naomi felt the blood drain from her face. Around her, people shifted in their seats, murmuring to each other, wondering who had written such words to the CEO. "These words," Julian continued, his voice taking on an intensity that made everyone lean forward, "reminded me that leadership isn't about commanding from the top of a tower. It's about seeing the people who make everything possible, especially those who think they're invisible." His eyes found Naomi's across the room. This time he didn't look away. "Whoever wrote this signed it with initials, N.E. Julian's gaze remained steady on her face. "And I want to meet this person. Not to reprimand them, not to question their presence in my office, but to thank them for reminding me what kind of leader I want to be." Naomi couldn't breathe. The room around her seemed to blur at the edges, and she was certain everyone could hear her heart pounding. Fitzgerald glanced at her curiously, probably wondering why she looked like she was about to faint. "I'm implementing some changes," Julian announced, though his attention seemed partially focused on the back of the room. "Starting next week, I'll be spending time on every floor, meeting with employees individually. Not performance reviews, not evaluations, just conversations. I want to know who you are beyond your job descriptions." Applause started slowly, then grew stronger. People were smiling, the tension in the room transforming into something that felt almost like hope. "One more thing," Julian added as the clapping died down. "If N.E. is in this room, I'd like to speak with you after this meeting. Not as your CEO, but as someone who needed to hear your words yesterday more than you could possibly know." The meeting ended with instructions about the upcoming individual sessions and reminders about quarterly deadlines. But Naomi heard none of it. She was trapped in a bubble of panic and disbelief, watching as people filed out of the conference room, chatting excitedly about the unexpected turn of events. Carmen Rodriguez touched her shoulder gently. "You okay? You look pale." I'm fine," Naomi managed, though her voice sounded far away to her own ears. As the room emptied, she remained in her seat, watching Julian organize his notes at the podium. Beverly approached him with a question about scheduling, and they spoke in low tones, while Naomi debated whether she should run for the elevator or find the courage to walk down that endless aisle to the front of the room. Finally, Julian looked up and found her still sitting there. Their eyes met across the empty chairs and he smiled, not his professional measured CEO smile, but something genuine and warm, that made her stomach flutter with butterflies she didn't know she still had. He walked toward her, each step deliberate but not intimidating, and Naomi realized that her entire life was about to change, and she had no idea if she was ready for what came next. Truth has a way of finding you, even when you're hiding in the shadows. The distance between Naomi's chair and the podium felt like crossing an ocean. Each step echoed in the empty conference room, her black heels clicking against polished marble in a rhythm that matched her racing heart. Julian remained perfectly still, watching her approach with an expression she couldn't read, patient, curious, but not unkind. When she finally reached him, Naomi realized she had no idea what to say. All her carefully practiced words from sleepless nights of rehearsing conversations that would never happen seemed to evaporate in the space between them. "You don't have to say anything yet," Julian said softly, his voice different without the microphone, more intimate, more human. "But something tells me you're NE." Naomi nodded, barely able to manage even that small movement. Her throat felt dry as desert sand. She started, then stopped. Her hands trembled slightly, and she clasped them behind her back to hide the tremor. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Radcliffe. I never meant to leave anything personal on your desk. It was an accident. I was rushing to deliver contracts to legal, and I must have dropped it without thinking." Julian tilted his head, studying her face with genuine interest. "What's your name?" "Naomi Ellis. I'm a sectoral assistant on this floor. I've worked here for 3 years." The words tumbled out quickly, as if speaking faster would somehow make this conversation less terrifying. 3 years, Julian repeated. "And in 3 years, have we ever spoken before?" "No, sir. I tend to keep to myself." Something shifted in Julian's expression. Not disappointment, but something closer to regret. "That's my fault, isn't it? I've built a company where talented people feel invisible." Naomi looked up at him, surprised. She had expected anger, perhaps professional consequences, but not this kind of introspection. "You couldn't possibly know everyone who works here. There are hundreds of employees." "But I should know you," Julian said with quiet conviction. "The person who wrote those words, kindness doesn't need an audience. That person understands something about leadership that I've forgotten." Beverly appeared at the conference room entrance, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Radcliffe, your 10:30 with the Portland team is in 15 minutes. Julian didn't take his eyes off Naomi. "Cancel it." "Sir, reschedule everything until this afternoon." "And Beverly?" He finally turned toward his assistant. "I don't want to be disturbed for the next hour." Beverly's eyebrows rose slightly, the equivalent of shock for someone so professionally composed, but she nodded and left, closing the double doors behind her. "You cancelled a meeting for me." Naomi's voice was barely above a whisper. "I cancelled a meeting about textile imports from people I've talked to 17 times this month. I haven't cancelled the opportunity to have a real conversation with someone who clearly has something important to say." Julian gestured toward 2 chairs near the window. "Would you sit with me? Not as CEO and employee, just as 2 people talking." They settled into the chairs, and Naomi found herself looking out at the Manhattan skyline instead of at Julian. The morning sun cast long shadows across the city, and she could see tiny figures moving along the streets below, each one living their own complicated story. "Tell me about the note," Julian said. "Do you write them often?" "Every day," Naomi admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "Since college, my grandmother used to leave little messages for herself around her house, on mirrors, in books, tucked into her purse. After she passed away, I started doing the same thing. It helps me remember that even small moments can have meaning." "What was yesterday's message meant to remind you of?" Naomi was quiet for a long moment, watching a hawk circle above the buildings. "That it's okay to be kind even when no one notices. Sometimes, especially when no one notices." Julian leaned forward slightly. "You think no one notices your kindness?" "I know they don't." The words came out more bitter than she intended. "I'm very good at being invisible, Mr. Radcliffe. I've perfected it. Call me Julian, and you're wrong about being invisible." Something in his tone made her turn to look at him directly. His grey eyes were focused on her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. "I've noticed you," he continued. "Not just today, but before. I've seen you stay late to help Carmen from HR when she was overwhelmed with the new hire paperwork. I've watched you cover shifts for Fitzgerald when his mother was in the hospital. You think you're invisible, but some of us have been paying attention." Naomi felt heat rise in her cheeks. You've been watching me." "Not watching," Julian corrected quickly. "Noticing. There's a difference. A good leader notices the people who make things work, even when they don't want credit for it." "I don't understand why you're telling me this." Julian was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming softly against the chair arm. Honestly? Because your note made me realize I've been leading from behind a wall of glass and steel. I've been so focused on profit margins and board meetings that I forgot about the hearts behind the work. You reminded me that leadership should be about people, not just performance metrics. I was just writing a reminder to myself, Naomi said. I never meant to give anyone advice. Sometimes the most profound truths come from people who aren't trying to be profound. Julian smiled, and it transformed his entire face. Your accidental wisdom meant more to me than most intentional business counsel I receive. Naomi found herself smiling back, despite her nervousness. So I'm not fired? Julian laughed, a rich, genuine sound that she had never heard from him before. Quite the opposite. I'd like to know if you'd be interested in having lunch with me sometime. Not a business lunch, not a performance review, just lunch. Between two people who are trying to figure out how to be kind in a complicated world. You want to have lunch with me? Naomi's voice rose slightly in disbelief. Is that so surprising? You're Julian Radcliffe. She gestured vaguely at his perfectly tailored suit, the expensive watch, the aura of success that surrounded him like cologne. You're you, and you're just the person who reminded me who I want to be, Julian interrupted gently. You're just the woman who writes daily love letters to hope and leaves them scattered around the world like seeds. You're just Naomi Ellis, who has been working 3 feet away from my office for 3 years, being extraordinary while thinking she's ordinary. For the first time in the conversation, Naomi felt something besides nervousness. It was small and fragile, but it felt suspiciously like possibility. Okay, she said softly. Okay to lunch? Okay to lunch. Julian's smile widened. There's a small cafe around the corner from here. Moreau's. Do you know it? Naomi's eyes widened. That's where I go sometimes. Where I wrote that note, actually. Then it's perfect, Julian said, standing up. Tomorrow at noon? Tomorrow at noon, Naomi agreed, rising from her chair on slightly unsteady legs. They walked toward the conference room doors together, and Julian paused with his hand on the handle. Naomi? Yes? Thank you. For the note, for this conversation, for reminding me that the best parts of leadership happen when we stop trying to lead and start trying to serve. As the doors opened and they stepped back into the bustling office environment, Naomi felt like she was walking into a different world than the one she had left an hour ago. She just didn't know if she was brave enough to live in it. Some moments are so fragile that even breathing too deeply might shatter them. Naomi changed her outfit 3 times before settling on a simple navy dress that her sister Tessa had bought her for Christmas. It was professional enough for the office, but soft enough to feel like herself. She had arrived at Café Moreau's 15 minutes early, claiming a small table by the window where she could watch for Julian's arrival and calm her racing thoughts. The cafe was exactly as she remembered it. Weathered brick walls lined with local artwork, mismatched vintage chairs, and the comforting aroma of fresh bread mingling with coffee. It was the kind of place where conversations happened in gentle murmurs, where people came to write in journals or read novels with dog-eared pages. She had chosen this place months ago as her sanctuary, precisely because it felt invisible, tucked between a dry cleaner and a used bookstore on a side street that most people walked past without noticing. Now Julian Radcliffe, who probably ate lunch in boardrooms with million-dollar views, was about to sit across from her at a wobbly table covered with a faded, checkered tablecloth. At exactly noon, she saw him through the window. But this wasn't the Julian Radcliffe she knew from the office. Gone was the armor of expensive suits and corporate authority. Instead, he wore dark jeans and a grey sweater that made his eyes look like storm clouds. His hair was slightly tousled, as if he had run his fingers through it, and he moved with less rigid precision than she was used to seeing. The bell above the cafe door chimed softly as he entered, and his eyes found hers immediately. He smiled, that genuine transformative smile she had seen yesterday, and suddenly the nervous knot in her stomach loosened just a fraction. I wasn't sure you'd come, Julian said, as he settled into the chair across from her. I wasn't sure I would either, Naomi admitted, then felt her cheeks warm at her honesty. Julian laughed, and the sound seemed to make the entire cafe brighter. I appreciate the honesty. I've been in enough business lunches where people say what they think I want to hear. It's refreshing to sit across from someone who says what they actually mean. A server approached, a young woman with purple-streaked hair and a canvas apron covered in paint stains. What can I get you folks today? I'll have the turkey and avocado on sourdough, Julian said, and coffee. Black. Same sandwich for me, Naomi said, but with a cappuccino, please." As the server walked away, Julian raised an eyebrow. "Same sandwich. It's what I always order here," Naomi explained. "I guess I'm not very adventurous when it comes to food. Or maybe you know what you like and you're not afraid to stick with it. There's wisdom in that." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the lunch crowd through the window. Office workers hurried past with takeout bags, tourists consulted maps on their phones, and an elderly man fed pigeons from a park bench across the street. "Can I ask you something?" Julian said finally. "Of course. What made you start writing those daily notes to yourself?" Naomi traced the rim of her water glass with her finger, considering the question. "My grandmother Lorelei raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12. She had this way of finding magic in ordinary moments. She'd leave little notes for herself everywhere, in her coat pockets, tucked into library books, taped to the bathroom mirror." Julian listened without interrupting, his attention completely focused on her words. "After she died during my sophomore year of college, I felt lost," Naomi continued. "The world suddenly seemed so harsh and indifferent, so I started writing notes like hers, little reminders that kindness still mattered, that small gestures could still carry weight. It was my way of keeping her voice alive in my head." "She sounds extraordinary." She was. She used to say that the world was full of people performing for audiences, but the most important acts of love happen when no one's watching. Julian was quiet for a long moment, and Naomi worried she had shared too much, revealed too much vulnerability too soon. "My father died 2 years ago," Julian said finally. "Heart attack in his office at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night. He was working on a merger that would have made the company another $50 million. Naomi reached across the table instinctively, covering his hand with hers. The gesture surprised them both, and she started to pull away, but Julian turned his palm up and gently held her fingers. "I used to think that was admirable," Julian continued, his thumb tracing circles on her knuckles. "The dedication, the single-minded focus on success. But after he died, I realized he had missed most of his life while building his empire. He never knew the names of our building's security guards. He never asked our assistants about their families. He led through intimidation rather than inspiration. Is that why my note affected you so strongly?" "Partly, but mostly it was the timing. I had just gotten out of a board meeting where we discussed laying off 30 employees to increase quarterly profits. 30 people with families, mortgages, dreams, and we were talking about them like line items on a spreadsheet." Julian's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "Then I found your note, and it was like someone had opened a window in a room I didn't realize was suffocating me." Their sandwiches arrived, but neither of them immediately reached for food. The connection between them felt too fragile to interrupt, with mundane actions like eating. "What do you want your leadership to look like?" Naomi asked. "I want to know my employees' names. I want to understand what motivates them beyond paychecks. I want to build something that serves people, not just stockholders." Julian smiled ruefully. "Revolutionary concepts in corporate America. Not revolutionary, just human." Julian studied her face intently. "How did you become so wise at 27? 27 years of practice at being invisible teaches you to watch people carefully. You learn to read the stories they don't tell out loud." "What story do I tell that I don't say out loud?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and risk. Naomi looked at Julian's face, really looked at him, not as the intimidating CEO, but as a man sitting across from her in a small cafe, holding her hand like it was something precious. "You tell the story of someone who spent so long being strong for everyone else that you've forgotten it's okay to be vulnerable sometimes. You tell the story of someone who inherited a kingdom but dreams of building a garden." Julian was absolutely still, his gray eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "And what story do you tell without words?" he asked softly. "I tell the story of someone who spent so long hiding that she's forgotten how to be seen. Someone who writes love letters to hope because she's afraid to believe she deserves to receive them." They sat in that moment of truth, their hands intertwined on the small table, the noise of the cafe fading into background static. Naomi felt exposed and terrified, and more alive than she had in years. "Naomi," Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what if we helped each other rewrite our stories?" Before she could answer, her phone buzzed insistently. A text message from Deanna Walsh. "Emergency at the office. Need you back immediately." Reality crashed back like cold water. Naomi reluctantly pulled her hand free and reached for her phone, the spell of the moment breaking. "I have to go back," she said. genuine regret in her voice. "Office emergency." Julian signaled for the check. "I'll walk with you." "You don't have to." "I want to." As they stepped back onto the busy street, Julian caught her arm gently. "This doesn't end here, does it?" Naomi looked up at him, seeing something in his expression that looked suspiciously like hope mixed with vulnerability. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to be the kind of person someone like you notices." "You already are," Julian said simply. "You've always been. The only question is whether you're brave enough to believe it." As they walked back toward Radcliffe Industries, Naomi realized that the scariest part wasn't Julian seeing her. It was the possibility that she might finally be ready to let herself be seen. The hardest part about stepping into the light is that everyone can suddenly see your shadow. The emergency that had pulled Naomi away from lunch turned out to be a system crash that deleted 3 hours of data entry work. As she sat at her computer, manually recreating spreadsheets that should have been backed up automatically, her mind kept drifting to the feeling of Julian's hand covering hers, the way his eyes had softened when she shared memories of her grandmother. But the magic of Café Moreau's felt increasingly distant as the afternoon wore on. Here, surrounded by the familiar hum of fluorescent lights and office politics, the idea that Julian Radcliffe, had asked about rewriting their stories together seemed like something she might have imagined. Well, Deanna Walsh's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence after an extended lunch break." Naomi glanced at the clock. 1:47 p.m. She had been gone for exactly 1 hour and 47 minutes. "The system crash happened while I was at lunch. I came back as soon as I got your message." "Convenient timing." Deanna's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Almost like you knew the system would fail and decided to extend your little break." "Mrs. Walsh, I would never—" "Save it, Ellis. Just get those client files reconstructed before the end of the day. And next time, maybe consider eating at your desk like the rest of us dedicated employees." As Deanna clicked away on her stilettos, Carmen Rodriguez appeared beside Naomi's cubicle with a sympathetic expression and a cup of coffee from the break room. "Don't let her get to you," Carmen said quietly. "She's been in a mood all week since her request for a promotion got denied." "Thanks." Naomi accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Carmen, can I ask you something?" "Shoot." "Have you ever felt like you were living 2 different lives? Like the person you are in one place doesn't match who you could be somewhere else?" Carmen studied her face carefully. "This wouldn't have anything to do with why you looked like you were glowing when you came back from lunch, would it?" Heat crept up Naomi's neck. "I don't know what you mean." "Honey, I've been working in HR for 8 years. I can spot the signs of a good lunch date from across the building." Carmen leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Please tell me you're not getting involved with someone from the office. That never ends well." Before Naomi could respond, a ripple of whispers spread across the floor. She looked up to see Julian emerging from the elevator, but instead of heading directly to his corner office as usual, he was walking slowly through the cubicle area, stopping to chat with employees. "Afternoon, everyone," he said to a cluster of junior analysts. "How's the Henderson project coming along?" Naomi watched in fascination as her colleagues, people who normally scattered like startled birds when Julian appeared, actually smiled and engaged in conversation. He remembered their names, asked specific questions about their work, and listened to their answers with genuine attention. "Is he having some kind of breakdown?" whispered Fitzgerald from the next cubicle over. "I've never seen him act so human." Julian's path through the office seemed random, but Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that it would eventually lead him to her section. Sure enough, after conversations with the marketing team and a brief chat with the security guard, he approached her area. "Ms. Rodriguez," Julian said warmly, "how is your daughter adjusting to middle school?" Carmen's eyebrows shot up in surprise. She's doing well. Thank you for asking, Mr. Radcliffe. I didn't realize you knew about Elena. I make it my business to know about the people who make this company run smoothly." Julian's smile was genuine. "And Mr. Chen, I heard your mother is recovering well from her surgery." Fitzgerald looked like he might fall out of his chair. "Yes, sir. She's home now, getting stronger every day." "I'm glad to hear it. Please give her my best wishes." Finally, Julian's attention turned to Naomi. She felt her colleagues' curious gazes like spotlights, suddenly aware that whatever happened next would be analyzed and discussed for weeks. "Ms. Ellis," Julian said, his tone carefully professional, but with a warmth that made her stomach flutter. "I wanted to thank you again for our conversation yesterday. Your insights about workplace culture have given me a lot to think about." "Of course, Mr. Radcliffe." Naomi managed, proud that her voice remained steady. "I'm glad I could help. I wonder if you might have time for a follow-up discussion later this week. I'm developing some new employee engagement initiatives, and I could use your perspective." The office had gone completely silent. Even the phones seemed to have stopped ringing. Yes, I'd be happy to help with that," Naomi said. "Excellent. Beverly will reach out to schedule something." Julian nodded politely to the group and continued on his rounds, leaving behind a wake of stunned silence. The moment he was out of earshot, the whispers exploded. Did Julian Radcliffe just personally thank Naomi Ellis? What conversation was he talking about? Since when does the CEO ask for random employees' perspectives on company initiatives? Deanna Walsh materialized beside Naomi's desk like a storm cloud. "What exactly did you discuss with Mr. Radcliffe yesterday?" "Just company culture, employee morale." Naomi tried to keep her voice neutral, but she could feel the weight of everyone's attention pressing down on her. "Interesting." Deanna's eyes were cold as winter. "And how exactly did this conversation come about? Did you request a meeting? Submit a proposal?" "It was during the emergency meeting. He asked to speak with whoever wrote the note and I—" "You wrote the note?" Carmen interrupted, her voice rising with surprise. "The one he read to everyone?" Naomi nodded reluctantly, and the whispers around them intensified. "Our little invisible mouse has been giving leadership advice to the CEO," Deanna said loudly enough for half the floor to hear. "How ambitious of you, Ellis." The word ambitious dripped with implication, and Naomi felt her cheeks burn. She could read the subtext in her colleagues' expressions. What did she do to get Julian's attention? What was she really offering in these conversations about company culture? "It wasn't like that," Naomi said quietly, but her voice was lost in the growing buzz of speculation. As the afternoon wore on, Naomi felt the shift in the office atmosphere like a physical weight. Conversations stopped when she approached the copy machine. People stared openly when they thought she wasn't looking. Someone had even started a betting pool about whether she would get promoted or fired by the end of the month. At 4:30, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Julian. I got your number from HR. Are you okay? The office feels different since this afternoon." She stared at the message, torn between relief that he had noticed the tension and panic that he was texting her personal phone. Anyone could see her checking messages. Anyone could start asking questions about who was making her smile at her desk. She typed back quickly, "I'm fine, just adjusting to being visible." His response came immediately. "Visibility can be overwhelming. Want to talk about it? Same place as yesterday, 6 p.m. Naomi looked around the office. Deanna was watching her with hawk-like intensity. Carmen kept shooting her concerned glances. Even Fitzgerald seemed nervous whenever she caught his eye. She thought about Julian's question from lunch. What if we helped each other rewrite our stories? Maybe it was time to stop letting other people write her story for her. She texted back, "Yes, see you then." As she gathered her things to leave at 5 o'clock, Deanna appeared one final time. "Ellis," she said quietly, but with unmistakable venom, "I don't know what game you're playing, but be very careful. Office romances have a way of ending badly for the person with less power. And in case you've forgotten, you're still just a sectoral assistant who can be replaced." Naomi met Deanna's gaze steadily, surprised by her own calm. "I haven't forgotten anything, Mrs. Walsh, especially not that I'm good at my job, regardless of who notices it." As she walked toward the elevator, Naomi realized that stepping into the light meant accepting that some people would always try to push you back into the shadows. But maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to fight for her place in the sun. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is trust someone else with the parts of yourself you've kept hidden. By the time Naomi reached Café Morose, the early evening light was painting the brick buildings in shades of gold and amber. She found Julian already there, sitting at the same table by the window, but this time he wasn't alone. An elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes sat across from him, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. Naomi hesitated at the entrance, suddenly feeling like an intruder in a private moment. Julian looked up and saw her through the glass, immediately standing and gesturing for her to come inside. "Naomi, I'd like you to meet Margot Dubois," Julian said as she approached their table. "She owns this cafe and she's been listening to me complain about corporate life for the past 2 years. Margot studied Naomi with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. "Ah, so you are the mysterious NE who wrote the note that has turned my grumpy customer into an optimist." "Margot," Julian protested, but his smile betrayed his affection for the older woman. "Don't Margot me, young man. I've been serving you terrible coffee and day-old pastries every Tuesday for 24 months, listening to you complain about board meetings and merger deadlines. Then yesterday you walk in here practically glowing, talking about employee engagement and meaningful leadership. Margot stood up, patting Julian's shoulder fondly. I'll leave you two to your conversation, but Naomi, she turned to face her directly. Whatever you said to this one, don't let him forget it. After Margot disappeared behind the counter, Julian and Naomi sat in comfortable silence for a moment. The cafe was quieter at this hour, with only a few other customers scattered among the mismatched tables. She's wonderful, Naomi said finally. She reminds me of what you said about your grandmother, someone who finds magic in ordinary moments. Julian's expression grew more serious. How was the rest of your afternoon? I got the feeling my little walkabout caused some complications. Naomi traced patterns on the wooden table with her finger, choosing her words carefully. People are asking questions, making assumptions. What kind of assumptions? The kind that happen when a CEO suddenly starts paying attention to someone who's been invisible for 3 years. She looked up at him, searching his face. Julian, what are we doing, really? I was hoping you could help me figure that out. I'm serious, I need to understand what this is before it goes any further. My supervisor thinks I'm scheming for a promotion. My colleagues are placing bets on whether I'll be fired or transferred, and everyone seems to believe I'm using some kind of feminine influence to get your attention. Julian's expression darkened. Who said that? It doesn't matter who. What matters is that I've spent 3 years building a reputation as someone reliable and professional, and now that's all being called into question because we had lunch together. I'm sorry, Julian said quietly. I didn't consider how my attention might affect your position. I've been so focused on how you've changed my perspective that I didn't think about the consequences for you. That's the thing about power, Naomi said. The person who has it rarely thinks about how its use affects the people who don't. Julian was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the truth of her words. You're right, and I hate that you're right. I'm not trying to hurt your feelings. I'm trying to be honest about the reality we're dealing with. What do you want me to do? Stop talking to you? Pretend yesterday's conversation never happened? The question hung in the air between them, and Naomi realized they had reached a crossroads. One path led back to the safety of invisibility, to her small cubicle and predictable routines. The other led into unknown territory that might cost her everything she had worked to build. What I want, Naomi said slowly, is to understand what you see when you look at me, because I need to know if it's real or if I'm just a convenient symbol of the leader you want to become. Julian leaned forward, his grey eyes intense. You want to know what I see? She nodded. I see someone who writes daily love letters to hope and leaves them scattered around the world like breadcrumbs for people who have lost their way. I see someone who covered extra shifts for a colleague whose mother was sick, not because anyone asked you to, but because it was the right thing to do. I see someone who has been quietly holding this company together while the rest of us focused on profit margins and performance metrics. Naomi felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. But more than that, Julian continued, I see someone who challenges me to be better without even trying. Someone who reminds me that leadership isn't about commanding from the top of a tower. It's about serving the people who make everything possible. And what do you see when you look in the mirror? Naomi asked. Julian was quiet for a long time, his fingers drumming against his coffee mug. Someone who inherited a kingdom but doesn't know how to be a king. Someone who spent so long learning to be strong that he forgot how to be human. That's not what I see. What do you see? I see someone who noticed when a colleague's mother was sick, even though you were probably dealing with million-dollar decisions. I see someone who reads handwritten notes from strangers and lets them change his perspective on leadership. I see someone brave enough to admit he doesn't have all the answers. Their eyes met across the small table, and Naomi felt that same electric connection from the day before, as if the air between them was charged with possibility. Naomi, Julian said softly, I can't promise this will be easy. I can't promise that people won't ask questions or make assumptions, but I can promise that whatever this is between us, it's real. It's not about power or positions or corporate politics. It's about two people who see something in each other that they didn't know they were looking for. And if it costs me my job, then I'll make sure you have a better one, but not as a favor, not as compensation, because you deserve better than being invisible in a company that should celebrate your contributions. Naomi studied his face, looking for any sign of insincerity or calculated charm, but all she saw was honesty, vulnerability, and something that looked suspiciously like hope. I'm scared, she admitted. So am I. You're Julian Radcliffe. What could you possibly be scared of? I'm scared of being the kind of man my father was, successful but empty, powerful but alone. I'm scared that I'll disappoint you, or that I'll use my position in ways that hurt you. Mostly I'm scared that I'll wake up tomorrow and discover that you're too wise to risk your peace of mind on someone who's still figuring out how to be human. Naomi reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the gesture feeling natural now. What if we make a deal? I'm listening. What if we agree to figure this out together but carefully? No grand gestures at work, no public displays that fuel more speculation. We get to know each other as people first, not as CEO and employee. Julian turned his palm up and intertwined their fingers. And how do we do that? We meet here. After work on weekends, whenever we can steal time away from the glass towers and office politics, we talk about books and dreams and fears and the things that make us human, and we see what grows between us when it's not being scrutinized by 100 pairs of curious eyes. A secret courtship, Julian said, his smile returning. How very Jane Austen of us. More like self-preservation, Naomi laughed. But yes, I suppose there's something romantic about it. Julian lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, the gesture so tender it made her breath catch. Then we have a deal, Naomi Ellis. Let's see what we can build in the spaces between the official world. As they sat in the golden light of the cafe, hands intertwined across a worn wooden table, both of them knew they were crossing a line from which there might be no return. But for the first time in years, neither of them wanted to retreat to safety. The most beautiful flowers grow in hidden places, where they're protected from storms until they're strong enough to bloom in the light. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that felt like a secret song only Naomi and Julian knew the words to. They met at Café Moreau's twice a week, always after 6 when the office crowd had dispersed and the evening belonged to them. On Saturdays, they discovered small bookstores in Greenwich Village, where Julian would read poetry aloud while Naomi browsed philosophy sections. On Sundays, they walked through Central Park, talking about everything except work. At the office, they maintained careful professional distance. Julian's employee engagement initiative had become the talk of the company. Individual meetings with staff members, policy changes that prioritized work-life balance, even a suggestion box that people actually used because they believed their ideas might be heard. But whenever he passed Naomi's cubicle, their eyes would meet for just a moment, and she would see the warmth there that was meant only for her. It was during one of their Saturday afternoon wanderings that Julian surprised her by leading her down a narrow alley between 2 brownstones in the Upper West Side. "Where are we going?" Naomi asked, following him through what looked like a service entrance. "Trust me," Julian said, producing a key from his pocket. "I want to show you something." The door opened onto a small courtyard garden, hidden completely from the street. Ivy climbed weathered brick walls, and late-blooming roses spilled over wooden planters. A small fountain bubbled in the center, surrounded by benches that had been worn smooth by time and weather. "Julian, this is incredible," Naomi breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "How did you find this place?" "I didn't find it. I made it." Julian's voice carried a note of shy pride she had never heard before. "This courtyard belongs to the building I live in. When I moved here 5 years ago, it was just concrete and weeds. I started bringing plants home from the nursery, one at a time. My neighbors thought I was losing my mind. Why would a CEO want to get dirt under his fingernails?" Naomi walked over to examine the roses more closely. They were perfectly tended, each bush showing signs of careful pruning and devoted attention. "This must take hours of work, every Saturday morning for 5 years. It's the only time I feel completely myself. No meetings, no decisions that affect hundreds of people. Just me and the soil and the quiet work of helping things grow." She turned to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Why are you showing me this?" Julian moved closer, his hands finding her waist gently. "Because you said you wanted to know each other as people first, not as CEO and employee. This garden, this is who I am when I'm not performing for the world. This is the person I am when no one's watching." Naomi placed her hands on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palms. "It's beautiful, Julian. You've created something miraculous here. It's not the only thing I want to create," he said softly, his forehead resting against hers. The kiss was inevitable, as natural as breathing. Julian's lips were warm and gentle, and Naomi felt something inside her chest bloom like one of his carefully tended roses. When they finally broke apart, She was surprised to find tears on her cheeks. "I've never had anyone show me their secret garden before," she whispered. "I've never had anyone I wanted to share it with." They spent the afternoon on one of the weathered benches, talking about childhood dreams and adult disappointments. Julian told her about the year he had wanted to be a botanist instead of inheriting the family business. Naomi shared her secret ambition to write children's books someday, stories that would help kids find magic in ordinary moments the way her grandmother had taught her. "What's stopping you from writing?" Julian asked, his arm around her shoulders as evening light filtered through the ivy. "Time, courage, the usual suspects." Naomi laughed, but it sounded hollow even to her own ears. "What if I told you that one of the things I admire most about you is your storytelling ability, the way you describe people, the way you see beauty in small moments? You already think like a writer. It's just a dream. Dreams are just plans that haven't been acted on yet." On Monday morning, Naomi arrived at the office to find a small package on her desk. Inside was a leather-bound notebook with her initials embossed in gold on the cover, along with a card that simply read, "For the stories you're brave enough to tell, J." She looked up to see Julian emerging from the elevator, and their eyes met across the bustling office floor. He smiled, barely a curve of his lips, but she felt it like sunshine, and continued to his office without a word. "Secret admirer?" Carmen appeared beside her cubicle, eyeing the expensive notebook. "Something like that," Naomi said, running her fingers over the smooth leather cover. That evening, for the first time in weeks, she didn't meet Julian at the cafe. Instead, she went home to her small apartment in Queens, made a cup of tea, and opened the notebook to the first pristine page. Once upon a time, there was a woman who forgot how to believe in fairy tales. The words flowed like they had been waiting years to be written. She wrote about invisible girls and secret gardens, about the magic that happens when someone sees you exactly as you are and finds you beautiful anyway. She wrote until her hand cramped and her tea grew cold, filling page after page with the story that had been growing in her heart. Her phone buzzed at midnight with a text from Julian. "You weren't at the cafe tonight. Everything okay?" She typed back, "Better than okay. I'm writing." "About what?" Naomi smiled, looking at the notebook filled with her handwriting, at the words that felt like coming home to herself. "About a woman learning to believe she deserves her own happy ending." Julian's response came immediately. "Can't wait to read it. Sweet dreams, Naomi." As she prepared for bed, Naomi caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. Her eyes were bright, her smile genuine, her posture straighter than it had been in years. She looked like someone who had remembered what it felt like to hope. But she also looked like someone who was falling in love, and that realization both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. At work the next day, Deanna Walsh seemed to sense the change in her immediately. "You seem different lately, Ellis," Deanna said, appearing beside her desk with a stack of files. "Almost confident. I hope that doesn't mean you're getting ideas above your station." "I'm just trying to do good work, Mrs. Walsh," Naomi replied evenly, though her heart rate quickened. "See that you remember where you belong," Deanna said pointedly. "Some people mistake temporary attention for permanent change. That rarely ends well for anyone involved." As Deanna walked away, Naomi felt a chill of premonition. She glanced toward Julian's office, where she could see him through the glass walls, deep in conversation with what looked like the entire executive team. Something was shifting in the careful balance they had built, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their secret garden was about to face its first real storm. But some flowers, once they've tasted sunlight, refuse to retreat back into the shadows, no matter how fierce the weather becomes. When you've lived in the shadows for so long, you forget that standing in the light makes you a target for those who prefer the darkness. The first sign that their carefully constructed world was about to collapse came on a Thursday morning in the form of an email from Human Resources. Naomi stared at the subject line, "Mandatory meeting regarding workplace conduct," with growing dread. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. with Lydia Hartwell, the head of HR, and would also include Deanna Walsh. No explanation was provided, but Naomi's stomach twisted with the certainty that their secret had somehow stopped being secret. She managed to catch Julian's eye as he passed through the office area that morning, and the slight questioning tilt of his head told her he had no idea what was happening either. She gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head, and she saw his jaw tighten with concern. At exactly 2 p.m., Naomi sat in the sterile conference room on the 38th floor, facing two women whose expressions ranged from stern to openly hostile. Lydia Hartwell was in her 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and glasses that seemed designed to make her eyes look colder. Deanna Walsh sat beside her, barely containing what looked like vindicated satisfaction. "Ms. Ellis," Lydia began, consulting a file in front of her, "we've received some concerning reports about your conduct in the workplace, specifically allegations of inappropriate fraternization with a superior." Naomi's mouth went dry. "I'm not sure I understand what you're referring to." "Multiple employees have reported unusual interactions between you and Mr. Radcliffe," Deanna interjected, her voice sharp with accusation. "Extended private conversations, special attention during his floor visits, and what appears to be preferential treatment regarding upcoming promotion opportunities." "Promotion opportunities?" Naomi's voice rose slightly. "I haven't applied for any promotions." "But you have been positioning yourself to receive one, haven't you?" Lydia's tone was coldly professional. "Using personal relationships to advance your career is a serious violation of company policy." "That's not what's happening," Naomi said firmly, though her heart was pounding so hard she was certain they could hear it. "Any conversations I've had with Mr. Radcliffe have been strictly professional." Deanna smiled, and it reminded Naomi of a snake preparing to strike. "Is that so? Then perhaps you can explain why you were seen entering a private residential building with him last Saturday afternoon, and why you've been observed having intimate conversations at various locations throughout the city." The room felt like it was spinning. Someone had been following them, watching them, documenting their private moments and turning them into ammunition. "Who told you this?" Naomi asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "That's confidential," Lydia replied. "What matters is that we have credible reports of conduct that violates our fraternization policies. As I'm sure you're aware, relationships between employees of significantly different levels are strictly prohibited." "Even if there was a personal relationship, which I'm not confirming," Naomi said carefully, "both parties would be consenting adults, and any such relationship would have no bearing on my professional performance." "That's naive, Ms. Ellis," Deanna said with false sympathy. "Personal relationships always affect professional dynamics. The appearance of impropriety is just as damaging as actual impropriety." Lydia leaned forward, her expression stern. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign a statement acknowledging that any personal contact with Mr. Radcliffe outside of necessary business interactions will cease immediately. You'll also agree to transfer to a different department to eliminate any perception of conflict of interest. And if I refuse, then we'll have no choice but to terminate your employment for violation of company policy." Naomi sat in stunned silence, processing the ultimatum. They were asking her to choose between Julian and her job, between love and financial security, between the first happiness she had felt in years and the professional reputation she had spent 3 years building. "I need time to consider this," she said finally. "You have until tomorrow morning," Lydia replied, sliding a document across the table. "The statement is already prepared. Sign it, and we can put this unfortunate situation behind us." As Naomi left the conference room, her legs felt unsteady beneath her. She made it back to her desk and sat down heavily, staring at the document without really seeing it. Around her, the office continued its normal rhythm, but she felt disconnected from it all, as if she were watching her life collapse from a great distance. Her phone buzzed with a text from Julian. "Can you meet tonight? Something's wrong. I can feel it." Before she could respond, Carmen appeared beside her cubicle. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I might have," Naomi said quietly. Carmen glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then leaned closer. "Naomi, I need to tell you something. This morning I overheard Deanna on the phone with someone talking about finally getting rid of the competition. I think she's been building a case against you." "Competition for what?" "She applied for the senior administrative position that's opening up next month. Word is, Julian was considering creating a new role for you instead." Naomi's heart sank. Julian had mentioned nothing about a new position, but if Deanna believed she was being considered for a promotion, it would explain the escalated hostility. That evening, Naomi arrived at Café Moreau's to find Julian already waiting, his usual composed demeanor replaced by barely contained anxiety. The moment he saw her face, his expression darkened. "What happened?" he asked immediately. Naomi sat down across from him and quietly explained the HR meeting, the allegations, and the ultimatum. Julian's hands clenched into fists on the table as she spoke. "They had us followed," Julian said when she finished. "Someone hired a private investigator to document our personal time together." "How can you be so sure?" Because I received a similar visit today. Not from HR, but from 3 board members who seem to think I'm having a midlife crisis that's affecting my judgment. Julian's voice was tight with anger. They have photographs, Naomi. Pictures of us at the bookstore, walking in the park, in my garden. Naomi felt sick. Their beautiful private moments had been turned into evidence against them. What did you tell them? That my personal life is none of their business. That any relationship I choose to have has no bearing on my professional capabilities. Julian reached across the table for her hand. But they've made it clear that if I continue seeing you, they'll call for a vote of no confidence. So we're both being asked to choose, Naomi said softly. It seems that way. They sat in heavy silence, watching the evening crowd outside the cafe window. Normal people with normal problems, going about their ordinary lives without having to choose between love and survival. Julian, Naomi said finally, what if we just walk away from all of it? You could start your own company. I could find a job somewhere else. We could build something together that belongs to us. Julian's smile was sad and full of regret. I can't ask you to give up your career for me, and I can't abandon the company my father built, the employees who depend on those jobs. Then what do we do? Julian was quiet for a long time, his thumb tracing circles on her knuckles. I think, he said slowly, we have to decide what we're willing to fight for and what we're willing to sacrifice. As they sat in the warm light of the cafe that had become their sanctuary, both of them knew that tomorrow would bring decisions that would change everything, and neither of them was sure they had the strength to make the right choice. Sometimes loving someone means being brave enough to risk everything and wise enough to know when the fight is worth it. Naomi didn't sleep. She spent the entire night staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, the HR document on her nightstand like a loaded weapon. Every few minutes she would reach for her phone to text Julian, then stop herself. What was there to say that they hadn't already said? By 5 a.m. she gave up on sleep and made coffee, sitting by her single window as Queens slowly woke up around her. The city looked different in the pre-dawn light, softer, more forgiving, as if the harsh edges of daylight hadn't yet sharpened into focus. Her phone buzzed with a message. I can't sleep either. Meet me at the garden? Without hesitation, she grabbed her coat and headed into the morning. Julian was already there when she arrived, sitting on their bench surrounded by the roses that were beginning their final bloom before winter. He looked like he hadn't slept either, his hair disheveled and his usual composure replaced by something raw and uncertain. I've been thinking all night, he said, as she settled beside him, about what you said yesterday, about walking away from all of it. And I realized that I've been approaching this all wrong. I've been trying to protect what I inherited instead of building what I believe in. Julian turned to face her fully. Naomi, what if we didn't choose between love and career? What if we chose to redefine what both of those things mean? I'm not sure I understand. Julian took her hands in both of his. I'm going to resign from Radcliffe Industries. Julian, no, you can't. Let me finish. His voice was calm but determined. I'm going to resign, but not to run away. I'm going to start something new. Something that operates on the principles you reminded me of. Kindness, humanity, genuine care for the people who make the work possible. Naomi stared at him, torn between admiration for his courage and terror at the implications. You're talking about giving up everything your family built. I'm talking about building something better, something that honors the best parts of what my father created while discarding the parts that turn people into statistics. Julian's eyes were bright with possibility. I've already spoken to several investors who are interested in ethical business practices. I have enough capital to start small, and I know at least a dozen talented people who would leave Radcliffe to join something that actually values them. And what about me? What am I supposed to do while you're building your ethical empire? Julian smiled, and she saw hope there that made her heart race. That depends. Are you interested in being the head of employee relations for a company that's actually committed to treating people like human beings? You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a partnership. In business, in life, in building something that matters. Julian squeezed her hands gently. But only if that's what you want. I won't make decisions for you, and I won't ask you to sacrifice your independence for my dreams. Naomi felt tears welling up, but for the first time in days they weren't tears of despair. What about the board? What about Deanna and her campaign against me? Let them have Radcliffe Industries. Let them run it into the ground with their politics and power games. We'll build something better, something that proves there's another way to succeed. It's a huge risk. The biggest, Julian agreed. But hiding in gardens and stealing moments between office hours, that's not living, Naomi. That's just surviving. And I think we're both done just surviving. Naomi looked around the garden that had become their sanctuary, at the roses that Julian had tended with such care, at the fountain that had witnessed their first kiss. This place had taught her that beautiful things could grow in hidden spaces, but maybe it was time to find out what could bloom in the open air. "There's something I need to do first," she said finally. An hour later, Naomi walked into the Radcliffe Industries building for what she knew would be the last time as an employee. She had left Julian in the garden, promising to meet him there again that evening with her answer. The 43rd floor felt different as she made her way to her cubicle. The same fluorescent lights, the same grey carpeting, the same hum of controlled productivity. But now, it all felt like a costume she had outgrown. Carmen was waiting by her desk with coffee and a concerned expression. "You look determined. That's either very good or very bad." "Probably both," Naomi said, pulling out the HR document and her laptop. She spent the next hour typing, her fingers moving with more confidence than they had in years. When she was finished, she printed 3 copies of what she had written and walked to Lydia Hartwell's office. "Ms. Ellis," Lydia said coolly as Naomi knocked on her open door. "I assume you're here to sign the agreement?" "Not exactly." Naomi handed her one of the copies. "I'm here to resign." Lydia's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Resign? Effective immediately. This letter outlines my reasons, which include the hostile work environment created by supervisory staff and the company's apparent policy of punishing employees for their personal relationships." "You can't be serious." "Completely serious." Naomi felt a calm strength settling over her, as if she were finally inhabiting her own skin properly. "I'm also filing a complaint with the State Labor Board regarding workplace harassment and invasion of privacy. Ms. Ellis, I think you should reconsider." "I've already reconsidered everything, Mrs. Hartwell, and I've decided that I'd rather work somewhere that values integrity over intimidation." Naomi left Lydia's office and walked directly to Deanna Walsh's desk, where she placed the second copy of her resignation letter. "Consider this your victory, Mrs. Walsh," Naomi said quietly. "You've successfully eliminated the competition. I hope the promotion you were so worried about brings you everything you expected." Deanna opened her mouth to respond, but Naomi was already walking away. Her final stop was Julian's office. Beverly looked up in surprise as Naomi approached. "Is he available for just a moment?" "He's on a conference call with—" "It's okay, Beverly." Julian's voice came through the open door. "Please hold my calls for 5 minutes." Naomi walked into the office that had once intimidated her so much, placing the 3rd copy of her letter on Julian's desk. "My resignation," she said simply. Julian picked up the letter and scanned it quickly, his expression shifting from surprise to admiration to something that looked very much like pride. "Any regrets?" he asked. "Just one." "What's that?" "I should have done this weeks ago." Julian stood and walked around his desk, stopping just inches away from her. "And your answer to my earlier question?" Naomi looked up into his grey eyes, seeing her future reflected there, uncertain, risky, but full of possibility. "Yes. Yes to the job offer. Yes to the partnership. Yes to building something that matters. Yes to being brave enough to choose love and integrity over safety and compromise." Julian's smile was radiant. "Yes to taking a leap of faith together. Yes to everything." He kissed her then, right there in his glass office where anyone could see where their secret had begun and where it was finally ending. When they broke apart, Naomi could see several employees had gathered near the windows, watching with expressions ranging from shock to delight. "Let them watch," Julian said softly. "Let them see what it looks like when people choose authenticity over appearances." As they walked out of Radcliffe Industries together, hand in hand, Naomi realized that sometimes the end of one story is really just the beginning of a better one, and some chances are worth risking everything to take. The most profound transformation happens not when we become someone new, but when we finally become who we were always meant to be. 6 months later, Naomi stood in front of floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the East River, watching the morning sun paint the water in shades of gold and amber. The office space was smaller than Radcliffe Industries, with exposed brick walls and plants scattered throughout the open floor plan, but it hummed with an energy that felt entirely different. Alive, collaborative, genuinely human. "Ellis Consulting Services," she had suggested when they were choosing a name for Julian's new company. "It has a nice ring to it." Julian had laughed, pulling her into his arms in the empty space that would become their headquarters. "I was thinking more like Radcliffe Ellis Enterprises. Equal partners, remember?" Now, as she looked around the thriving office they had built together, Naomi could hardly believe how much had changed. 23 employees, all of them recruited from companies that had undervalued their contributions. Carmen had been their first hire, bringing her expertise in human resources and her infectious optimism. Fitzgerald had joined them as head of IT, finally able to implement the innovative systems he had been proposing for years. Even Margot Dubois had played a role, agreeing to cater their office events after Julian convinced her that her terrible coffee was actually part of her charm. "The morning reports," Beverly said, appearing beside Naomi's desk with a stack of documents. Julian's former assistant had been one of their most surprising recruits. Apparently 12 years of watching corporate callousness had left her eager for a more meaningful work environment. "How are the numbers looking?" Naomi asked, though she could tell from Beverly's expression that the news was good. "Better than projected. The sustainable fashion client signed for another year, and we have 3 new companies interested in our employee wellness programs." Beverly smiled. "I think it's safe to say that ethical business practices are more profitable than anyone expected. Or maybe people were just hungry for companies that actually care about them," Naomi said, accepting the reports. "Speaking of caring," Beverly said with a knowing look, "Julian's been pacing in his office for the past hour. I suspect he has something on his mind that isn't related to quarterly projections." Naomi felt her cheeks warm. Even after 6 months of being together openly, working side by side to build something meaningful, there were still moments when Julian's attention made her feel like that invisible girl who had dropped a note by accident. She found Julian in his office, though office was a generous term for the glass-walled space that he insisted on keeping completely transparent. "No more leadership from behind barriers," he had said, when they were designing the space. "Beverly said you wanted to see me?" Naomi knocked on the open door frame. Julian looked up from his computer, and his expression shifted from distracted to radiant in the span of a heartbeat. "Always," he said, "but today I have something specific in mind. The Whitman Industries presentation isn't until next week. If you're worried about the proposal—" "Naomi." Julian stood and walked around his desk, reaching for her hands. "I'm not thinking about business right now." Something in his tone made her heart race. "What are you thinking about? About how 6 months ago you were brave enough to choose authenticity over safety. About how you've spent every day since then proving that the best leaders are the ones who lead with their hearts." Julian's thumbs traced gentle circles on her knuckles. "About how I want to spend the rest of my life building beautiful things with you." He dropped to one knee, and Naomi's breath caught in her throat. "I know this is unconventional," Julian said, reaching into his jacket pocket and producing a small velvet box. "Proposing in our office during business hours, where all our employees can see us through these ridiculously transparent walls." Naomi glanced around and realized that half their staff had indeed noticed what was happening and were trying to pretend they weren't watching, while clearly being unable to look away. "But I can't think of a more perfect place," Julian continued, opening the box to reveal a ring that took her breath away. It was vintage, with an emerald center stone surrounded by small diamonds, elegant and unique without being ostentatious. "Because this is where we proved that love and business can coexist, that partnerships built on respect and genuine care can create something extraordinary." Tears spilled down Naomi's cheeks, but she was smiling so widely, her face hurt. "Naomi Ellis," Julian said, his voice strong and sure. "Will you marry me? Will you be my partner in everything? Business, life, and all the beautiful chaos that comes with building dreams together?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, of course, yes." Julian slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. Of course it did, because Julian paid attention to details, noticed the things that others overlooked. Then he stood and kissed her, and the entire office erupted in applause and cheers. When they finally broke apart, Beverly appeared with champagne that she had apparently been keeping ready for this exact moment, and Carmen was crying happy tears, while Fitzgerald took pictures on his phone. "Wait," Naomi said suddenly, looking at the ring more closely. "This stone, it looks familiar." Julian's smile turned soft. "It belonged to my grandmother. She wore it for 63 years of marriage to a man who saw her brilliance when the world expected her to be invisible." He brushed a tear from Naomi's cheek. "She would have loved you. She would have recognized a kindred spirit, someone who writes daily love letters to hope and changes lives by simply being authentically herself." "Julian," Naomi said, her voice thick with emotion, "I have something to tell you too." "What's that?" "I finished the book." Julian's eyes widened. Your children's book? Naomi nodded, laughing through her tears. About a girl who learns that being invisible isn't the same as being insignificant, that sometimes the most important magic happens when someone sees you exactly as you are and finds you extraordinary. When do I get to read it? Tonight, after we celebrate properly. And what would proper celebration involve? Naomi looked around at their office full of people who had chosen meaning over money, relationships over corporate climbing, authenticity over appearances. She thought about the journey that had brought them here, a misplaced note, a moment of vulnerability, the courage to choose love over safety. Dinner in your secret garden, she said. Just us and the roses, and all the time in the world to talk about our future. Our future, Julian repeated as if tasting the words. I like the sound of that. As the celebration continued around them, Naomi felt a profound sense of completion, not the kind that comes from reaching an ending, but the kind that comes from finally beginning the story you were always meant to write. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Tessa. Carmen just sent me pictures. I'm crying in my office and my students think I'm having a breakdown. So happy for you. Another message, this one from an unknown number. Ms. Ellis, this is Lydia Hartwell from Radcliffe Industries. We'd like to discuss bringing you back as head of employee relations at a substantial salary increase. Naomi showed the message to Julian and they both burst into laughter. I think, Julian said, wrapping his arms around her waist, they may have missed the point entirely. Completely, Naomi agreed, deleting the message without responding. Some flowers can't be transplanted back into the shadows once they've learned to bloom in the light. As evening settled over the city and they made their way to Julian's garden, Naomi realized that the most beautiful love stories aren't about finding someone to complete you. They're about finding someone who inspires you to become the fullest version of yourself and then building a life together that honors both of your dreams. 2 years later, the most beautiful stories don't end. They simply transform into new beginnings, each chapter more radiant than the last. The autumn light filtered through the windows of the small independent bookstore in Brooklyn, casting golden shadows across the crowd of children and parents gathered in the reading corner. Naomi sat in the storyteller's chair, her wedding ring catching the light as she turned the pages of a beautifully illustrated book. And so, she read, her voice warm and engaging, Luna discovered that being invisible wasn't about being small or unimportant. It was about choosing when to step into the light and having the courage to shine when the moment was right. A little girl in the front row raised her hand enthusiastically. Is Luna based on you? Naomi smiled, glancing toward the back of the store, where Julian stood leaning against a bookshelf, their 6-month-old daughter Lorelei sleeping peacefully in his arms. Named after Naomi's grandmother, baby Lorelei had inherited her father's grey eyes and her mother's peaceful disposition. All the best stories have a little bit of truth in them, Naomi answered the child. But what's important isn't whether Luna is real. It's whether her story helps you remember that you have your own light to share with the world. After the reading ended and the last autograph was signed, the bookstore owner, Mrs. Chen, no relation to Fitzgerald, Julian had carefully confirmed, approached them with a warm smile. 3 printings in 6 months, she said admiringly. I've never seen a children's book resonate with readers quite like this one. The parents tell me they've learned as much from Luna's story as their children have. That was always the hope, Naomi said, gathering up her copies, that maybe adults would remember it's never too late to stop hiding their own light. As they walked out into the crisp October afternoon, Julian shifted baby Lorelei to one arm so he could take Naomi's hand with the other. Where to next? He asked. We have an hour before we need to be at the office for the anniversary celebration. The garden, Naomi said without hesitation. I want to see how the fall roses are doing. Julian's secret garden had become their family's sanctuary. He had added a small greenhouse the previous spring, and together they had expanded the plantings to include a section specifically for flowers that would bloom in every season. Their daughter's first word hadn't been mama or dada. It had been rose, spoken clearly while reaching for the coral-colored blooms that grew near the fountain. You know, Julian said as they settled onto their favorite bench, Lorelei now awake and contentedly watching the play of light through the autumn leaves. I never thanked you properly. For what? For that first note, the one you dropped by accident that changed everything. Naomi laughed, adjusting the baby's tiny knit hat. I think you've thanked me sufficiently. Marriage proposal, dream job, beautiful daughter, successful business that's changing how people think about workplace culture. So I'd say we're even. But I'm serious, Julian said. his voice taking on the soft intensity she had learned meant he was about to share something important. "Do you remember what you wrote that day? Kindness doesn't need an audience. Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the biggest hearts," Naomi recited. "I remember. I've been thinking about that lately, about how the smallest gesture, you dropping a note by accident, led to the biggest transformation of my life, our lives." Julian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a familiar piece of cream-colored paper, now carefully preserved behind glass in a small frame. "I had it framed," he said, handing it to her, "for the office. A reminder that the most important leadership lessons don't come from business schools or board meetings. They come from people who live their values so authentically that they can't help but inspire others." Naomi studied the framed note, remembering the person she had been when she wrote those words. Invisible, hopeful, writing love letters to a world that rarely seemed to notice her kindness. "Do you know what I've realized?" she said, looking up at him. "What's that?" "I thought that note was meant to remind me to be kind without expecting recognition. But maybe it was really the universe's way of putting the right words in the right place at the right time, so that two people who needed each other could find their way together." Julian leaned over and kissed her temple, breathing in the scent of her hair that still carried traces of the lavender soap she had always loved. "Speaking of the universe, putting things in the right place," he said, "Beverly told me something interesting today." "About what?" "About Radcliffe Industries. Apparently they've had 3 different CEOs in the past 2 years. The board finally voted to restructure the entire company, using principles very similar to the ones we built our business on." "Really?" "And Deanna Walsh was let go last month for creating a hostile work environment." Naomi felt a complex mix of emotions. Sadness for the people who had suffered under poor leadership, relief that changes were finally being made, and a strange sort of vindication that their approach had been validated. "I hope whoever they hire next does better," she said finally. "Those employees deserve leaders who see them as people, not just numbers." "That's one of the things I love most about you," Julian said, shifting Lorelei to his shoulder for burping. "Even after everything they put you through, you still hope for the best for them." "Kindness doesn't need an audience," Naomi quoted with a smile. "And forgiveness doesn't need an apology to exist." They sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon light shifted around them. 3 years of memories layering like sediment around the foundation of their love. The garden had grown more beautiful with each season, just as their relationship had deepened with each challenge they had faced together. "Naomi," Julian said eventually. "Do you ever miss it? The simplicity of being invisible?" Naomi considered the question seriously, watching their daughter's tiny fingers grasp at sunbeams. "Sometimes I miss the safety of it," she admitted. "It's easier to hide than to risk being seen and judged. But I don't miss the loneliness, and I don't miss the feeling that my life was something that happened to me rather than something I was actively creating. And now I wake up every morning knowing that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, with exactly the people I'm supposed to be with, doing exactly the work I'm supposed to be doing." She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Now I know what it feels like to be fully alive." As they prepared to leave for their company's anniversary celebration, 2 years of proving that businesses built on human values could thrive in a competitive marketplace, Julian paused at the garden gate. "One more thing," he said, pulling another note from his pocket. This one was new, written in his careful handwriting. "What's this?" "My turn to leave you a note," he said, with the boyish smile that still made her heart flutter. "But this one's not an accident." Naomi unfolded the paper and read, "Thank you for teaching me that the most profound leadership happens when we stop trying to be impressive and start trying to be human. Thank you for showing me that love isn't about finding someone to complete you. It's about finding someone who inspires you to become the fullest version of yourself. Thank you for building this beautiful life with me. J.R. Your grateful husband and eternal gardening partner." Tears sprang to her eyes as she looked up at him. "Julian, I love you, Naomi Ellis Radcliffe. I love the woman who writes daily reminders to be kind. I love the mother who reads stories about brave girls to rooms full of children. I love the partner who builds companies that change lives. But mostly, I love the person who taught me that the most extraordinary thing you can be is authentically yourself." As they walked hand in hand toward their next chapter, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them, Naomi realized that the most beautiful love stories aren't about finding your happy ending. They're about discovering that every ending is really just the beginning of something even more wonderful. Have you ever wondered if a simple act of kindness could change your entire life? Naomi never imagined that accidentally dropping a handwritten note would lead her to the love of her life and the career of her dreams. But sometimes the universe conspires to put the right words in front of the right person at exactly the right moment. What small act of kindness have you performed lately that might have touched someone's life without you even knowing it? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because just like Naomi's note, your words might be exactly what someone needs to hear today. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.